Chart 3. Median usual weekly earnings of women and men who are full-time wage and salary workers, by race and Hispanic or Latino ethnicity, 2020 annual averages. Race and Hispanic or Latino ethnicity. This particular chart, and any others like it, disaggregate race from gender as a concern. This enables us to distinguish between issues that may pertain to race or gender. As we'll see, the famed and infamous gendered pay gap is going to vary dramatically by race, and shrink in inverse proportion to the overall wealth of the racial category. In other words, if the racial category as a whole tends to be poorer, then the gender gap tends to be smaller. If the racial category tends to be richer, then the gendered gap tends to be wider. This is going to be a primary claim of this short piece, namely, that all concerns of gendered gap pay are actually nominal in current and can be reducible to a specific issue, namely, people not getting paid to have and raise babies. The claim being that the main reason for the pay gap is the time more affluent families tend to spend at home with their children outside of the workforce. This does disproportionately affect women, but the main thrust of the piece is that there isn't anything akin to the gendered pay gap that the current discourses portray, e.g. that women actually earn less money than men for the same work. Secondary to this is the point that income by household is far more relevant in terms of practical applications than individual earnings, e.g. whatever is being made is a matter of household income, not individual income. This is evident by the point that it is still the case that most families are monoracial, and that by far the larger factor of differences in pay rates is as it relates to race. The differences between men and women within a given racial grouping is small, and practically vanishes when we account for the time spent out of the workforce having and raising babies. Taken together, these 2 points seriously undercut the rhetoric surrounding the pay gap. There are in other words good reasons to suppose that the numbers are reflective of women not being as much in the workforce, taking time to have and raise babies in particular. Hence, it isn't particularly indicative of sexism, so much as a basic life process, the having and raising of babies, which ought be compensated for in a moneyed society. Though see also the points regarding the pragmatics and dubiousness of measuring justice via monies, and therein would remain rather serious concerns that folks being effectively punished by having and raising babies is not a good thing. Some of the main points, insofar as the gendered pay gap in the current remains within some as yet determined number, it is almost certainly not indicative of inherent sexism, rather, it is indicative of systemic aspects, not issues, and especially not sexist issues, whereby women are not being paid cash monies for doing the basic labors of life, the having and raising of babies. This is fairly crucial for folks to understand, as to not recognize this is to misapprehend the issues, and hence to misapply plausible solutions. In other words, how much wasted efforts, programs, words, time, theories, monies, etc. are being spent trying to fix inherent sexism when there is nothing there to fix. What gremlin in the system are people trying to hunt? Perhaps worse still, because the gendered pay gap is larger the more affluent the family, any fix targeted towards it are merely going to exacerbate the already far wider racial pay gaps. The largest single factor involved in the gendered pay gap being the degree whereby women are absent from the paid labor force. The bigger this factor is, the smaller the actual gendered pay gap really is. Here we are going to play some with these stats and try and suss out the point. This chart shows the gendered differences by race as a percentage difference. The top line shows the aggregated number. Note that most folks who want to emphasize, lie, about the gendered pay gap as a problem will tend to use the aggregated number as it masks the racial elements of the problem. As you can see, and not terribly surprisingly so, the white racial category is very near the aggregated average. Given that whites as a category still make up a majority of the populace, this ought not be too surprising. The Asian category, another affluent category of race, has a marginally higher gendered pay gap than the average or white category. But both of the affluent categories, white and Asian, have a markedly higher gendered pay gap than the less affluent categories, black and Hispanic or Latino ethnicity. It's important to note that what follows may not be statistically accurate, and that whatever statistics are out there on the topic may or may not be particularly applicable to the cited stats, as the way that averages are done, and what various factors may be involved in developing any given set of statistics can and oft do vary. However, it is just as important to note that what follows is a valid form of statistical argumentation, namely, that we are going to be making an argument outside of what the base stats provide in order to pose a hypothetical as a means of explanation. There are stats that back the claim up, namely, that the more affluent a home is, the more time one parent tends to spend with the children, and hence the greater the pay gap. It is just that the numbers used to generate those stats are not necessarily translatable to the numbers in this chart, as there may be a wide variety of factors that are considered in one chart that are not factored into the other. To be as blunt as I can be, there is plenty of data to back up the basic claim that the more affluent the family, the more likely there is a stay-at-home parent, and hence the more time the parents, as a total, tend to spend with their children. Indeed, there is so much and varied data on this that it is misleading to cite some specific set of it here, as it would give the impression that there's definitely a link between that specific data set and the one we are analyzing here, which there isn't. Look it up, folks. The relation of affluence to stay-at-home parents and time spent with children, and hence time spent out of the workforce, is real and well documented. It is just that the data used may have technical aspects to it that could muddy the waters if one were to try and apply them to the stats in these charts. Maybe a better statistician could do so, though, winking smiley. For those reasons here, I am going to be putting forth a mere hypothetical rather than any sort of actual statistics on the matter, to best illustrate the points being made. There is a caveat to such practices: we ought to use conservative numbers and estimates. Hence, we shall be using somewhat unrealistically conservative estimates and numbers, though we are also going to be doing some neat and pretty math, as in, using more round numbers to illustrate the point. This because the main point isn't strongly dependent upon the exactitude of the numbers involved, it is dependent upon the broad relationship between time spent out of the workforce and impact on income. To be upfront though, the neat and pretty number of 2 children per woman is actually statistically higher than the average, but in pragmatics is also reflective of plausible real median of children. In other words, no one has 1.78 children. Time spent out of the workforce, we will be assuming conservative numbers for both an affluent family that has the capacity to have one parent spend time as a stay-at-home parent, and as a matter of actual time one parent really does tend to spend outside the workforce due to child rearing. It is a hyper-conservative number for the former, and a modestly conservative number for the latter. But as we are dealing with broad average numbers, such seems appropriate. Note also that insofar as these numbers may be off, they are grossly favoring the claim of the gendered pay gap as being meaningful. Namely, that the more affluent the family, the more time out of the workforce one parent spends, and hence the conservative estimate grossly underestimates the effects that has on the final number. Whereas it is arguably the case that such a conservative estimate doesn't well capture the reality of the less affluent, who may actually tend to spend less than the number of years per child we are using out of the workforce. In terms of impact on earnings, we are going to be using a flat linear measure which almost certainly grossly undercounts the impact that it really has. In estimating the average working life of the worker, we shall be using a standard starting and retirement working age regardless of its realism to actual work life, as such is most applicable to most statistical analysis that cover that topic. The main point being, that in terms of the claims this piece is making, these are absurdly conservative numbers to be using. Hence we can reasonably assume that if the problem is true with these absurdly supposed numbers that do no justice to the point being made, then it is likely true if we were to use the more realistic actually applicable statistics. Which, again, is why this is a valid methodology of statistical analysis. Suppose that women are out of the workforce on average for 2 years per child they have. Suppose the neat rounded average of 2 children per woman. Hence, women would on average be out of the workforce for 4 years. Suppose that the working years of a woman are between 18 and 65, 47 years. To make things a bit neater and easier to work with, let's suppose that on average a woman actually spends 4.7 years of their life rearing and raising children rather than being in the paid workforce. This would mean that 10% of their work life is spent not at work. Let's pretend some and say that that number carries straightforwardly to their earnings, in other words, percent to percent, gendered difference in earnings to time spent out of workforce. Hence, we simply adjust all the gendered differences downward by 10% to account for the time that women are not in the workforce. Child rearing adjusted examples. Here it would be very tempting for the hostile readers to say something like, oh, well those are all just pretend numbers, so what, you can make them say or do anything you want. Alas, true, but the problem is that I have chosen to use quite conservative estimates. In other words, the factor that child rearing has on these numbers is almost certainly far greater than a 1-to-1 ratio, percent to percent. Leaving and coming back to the labor force is actually far more disruptive to someone's lifetime averages of earnings, as it affects things like raises and promotions, rather than a straightforward linear reduction in earnings. In other words, it has deleterious effects on person's rate of wage increases over their lifetime, not merely a subtraction of earnings for the 4.7 years they are out of the workforce. The point being that the hostile readers are not correct in their assumption that I am making up something to make the pretty stats look better. Though it is true that I did make up the number of years someone's is out of the labor force for each of the numbers, in addition to the earlier remarks on the conservative nature of those made-up stats, especially as they pertain to the points this piece is making, I'd also hold that ethically speaking someone of the parents, either the man or the woman, ought be out of the out-of-home labor force for more than merely 2 years per child tbh. In other words, as a matter of ethics, of oughts, I'd hold that is a seriously and unethically conservative estimate. I mention this as there is another group of hostile readers who may hear these concerns and make a different but related gendered argument, namely, that the problems are that women are being forced out of the workforce, and hence we all ought be good little worker bees and each be working equal amounts of time for master. Folks balking at the notion for that reason ought get their priorities straight regarding to what they are arguing for. In other words, if folks think that the reality ought be less time spent out the workforce, there is something seriously off in their ethical analysis. But that doesn't really matter in terms of what the current data on the matter is, and I am comfortable with the conservative estimates being used. Regardless, the point here is that the gendered pay gap starts to look a whole lot less impressive when these factors are taken into consideration. To the hostile readers, I'd add that the solution to the problem, cause there is a problem, is actually pointed out by this example: folks ought to get paid to rear children. That eliminates the actual causes in the current for there being a gendered pay gap at all. I'd go further and do a bit of interpretation on the data here. Namely, that there are reasons why the gap between men and women is larger the more affluent they are by racial grouping, namely, that they can afford to spend more time away from the paid labor force. In other words, the greater the privilege afforded to a given racial grouping, the higher the gendered pay gap will tend to be. Or, conversely, the greater the negative effect that race has on a grouping's earnings, the smaller the gendered pay gap, as both parents end up working more and spending less time raising their kids. We'd expect therefore to see similar kinds of trends if the stats were predicated upon merely income levels, though I'd point out crucially that there is a factor therein that musses the musings of figures a bit, namely, that being poor entails some not insignificant factor of joblessness, which has similar sorts of multiplicative nonlinear adjustments to the overall earnings of people. A major upshot here being that among the biggest likely contributors to the gendered pay gap is actually the capacity to rear children. How much time is spent rearing children may have an overriding determination as to what the gendered pay gap is. It can be tempting, and perhaps also fruitfully so, to carry forwards the notion that there is a kind of dynamic relationship between these factors of pay determination. Namely, that the more time spent per child rearing them, the more on average those children are to earn over the course of their lifetime. But that ends up being tempered by the fact that time spent rearing children is time spent not earning cash monies, hence, there is some sort of leveling off of the effects. Moreover, we could likewise hold that in absolute terms the more time spent rearing children the poorer one is, though not necessarily the poorer the household is. Still, there is a relation therein, whereby larger families tend to be poorer. I want to carry this forwards a bit to the point that legacies of racism play a significant role, as in, poorer families tend to have both parents working more, rearing time per child being less even if the overall time spent doing so is more, which tends to mean their children on average earn less via several factors. The way out of that trap, I mean, aside from not being racist assholes, is to force the issue, spend more time per child in child rearing. The simplest way to do that would be to actually bother paying folks for time spent rearing children. Such would be the relevant policy aims, while the pragmatics of the doing may very well entail doing it nonetheless, as in, despite the not getting of the cash monies, nonetheless spending more time per child in the rearing. Such may entail having fewer babies, and also such things as spending more time away from the paid labor workforce. This all assumes that there is a causal connection between rearing up children in a loving household, giving them quality education, and so forth, and them earning more cash monies as adults over their lifetimes. Such may be a one-step generational movement though. As in, it just takes one generation to do it for the next generation to benefit from it. A valid and reasonable sort of proposal for the pragmatics of breaking the legacy issues of racism. Firstly and most importantly is to break the bullshit surrounding the supposed gendered problem, so as to refocus the efforts to where the actual issue is, namely, racial differences. Secondarily is to not be racist pieces of shit. Tertiarily is to acknowledge the rather strong connection in the data regarding the supposed gendered pay gap to the time spent child rearing. From there one makes the argument as a means of breaking free from the legacy issues of racism. What the other factors are doing is somewhat more important than fiddling with the details of it, providing that the other factors are relevant. Among the upshots in this short piece is at what point does the difference in pay matter? Does a difference of, say, less than 10% really matter that much when we are speaking of averages, that is? Understanding, please understanding that such wouldn't indicate less pay for equal work, it would indicate that there are some other factors involved that entail that folks are not receiving the same amounts of cash monies over the course of their lifetimes. Moreover, when we are speaking of averages whereby all the various relevant factors are not even really fully accounted for. And I'd add that cash monies is not an end-all be-all of justice, gendered, racial or otherwise construed. There are serious problems when we reduce justice to the mereness of cash monies. This whole thing gets more muddled when we consider that the relevant figures are per household and not per individual, at least, that is, for the most part. As in, pragmatically what folks have to live on, what they get, is not per individual, but rather, per household. A difference of less than 10% between individuals on average, whatever that actually means, whereby all parties involved benefit and suffer equally in the household, makes it such that it is at least somewhat unclear as to what the issues really are. Though I would hasten to add that there are real issues there. The point of noting correctly that a per household income is the average income of relevance is not necessarily to claim that, therefore there are no issues, it is to give a better picture as to what those issues really are. Among them are such things as potential for financial abuse within the home. As in, one person who earns more monies is able to abuse the other person by withholding their rightful due of all the cash monies. With far less intentional bads to it, a significant disparity in incomes can entail a lacking of freedom, that is, being dependent upon someone else can place one in a position whereby they don't really have the freedom to live their life. Though on this one I would add a significant caveat that we are speaking of mere financial dependency, not dependency as such. The latter begins to erroneously push against love's connectivity at all, as if there is a problem with being dependent upon others at all. The former correctly pushes against the dependency of living at all via the dependency of monies, which is a fairly far larger problem. There is also a very cynical and faithless sort of person would denote that the money's dependency reinforces love's dependencies. As in, it forces familial and community bonds. However, I think such a view seriously misunderstands the ethical force of loves as being part and parcel of its being at all. To force loves is to not loves. I'd note that this highlights the main claims here that paying folks for child rearing, the having and raising of babies, handles these issues well. The classical argument was that women ought enter the workforce to break these kinds of dependencies, and without suggesting that women ought be at the home, again, someone, the man or the woman ought be at the home raising the babies. I think these points are better addressed by acknowledging the in-home labors that are done and paying people all the cash monies for doing so. This again pushes back against the more hostile readers who may suppose that there is some kind of horror attached to in-home labor that women must escape from, and hence that the solution is that we all go be good little worker bees for master. Similarly, the household incomes measure better reflects the relevant racial disparities we can if we so choose to chalk up to legacy issues in the currents rather than racial prejudices. That is, due to racial prejudices of old, rather than racial prejudices in the currents. Whereas the previous statistics factor out race to get at what, if any, gendered issues there may be, calculating by household tends to factor out gender, though not entirely so. As in, gendered differences such as they do exist within each household, thereby affecting the household incomes. Interestingly enough, at least by the set of data being used here, we'd expect that the affluence factors as they relate to gender will tend to have mitigating effect upon the racial factors per household. As in, the more affluent the bigger the gendered gap, entailing that the by race disparity per household incomes is not as bad as it otherwise would have been. Though they still bad. Interestingly and perhaps crucially of note, the affluence factor is strongly suggestive that the gendered pay gap is not reflective of a sexism against the woman's, but rather, reflective of a racism whereby what comes along with racial privilege is the capacity for someone within the family structure to be able to have the lux of staying at home with the babies. Folks ought seriously consider that aspect as it relates to the supposition of the gendered pay gap. Insofar as it exists, it is at least in part, and I'd say in no small part, actually indicative of a significant privilege that one gender, women, tend to have. The capacity to stay at home and raise the babies is no small privilege. It may also entail other bads, such as the aforementioned potential for financial abuse, and I'd seriously push folks again to the point that the aim is and ought be a moneyless free labor society, that these issues being described are in fact peculiar issues that arise within moneyed systems, and are issues that grossly mistake the issues of justice as being the issues of monies. I want to make explicit the differences by race compared to the difference by gender. To do this I am going to compare each race to the aggregated race gender stats, rather than as compared to each other. This I think provides a far better picture of what the actual differences are. Child-rearing adjusted examples, differences by race. Among the many upshots to note here is that even without using the child-rearing adjusted figures, the racial disparities are markedly larger than the gendered disparities. With the child-rearing adjusted figures, which again are conservative in their estimates, the racial disparities are hugely larger. Such seriously denotes where and what the real problems are. There are no obvious factors to apply to the racial disparities, beyond legacy issues of racism. In other words, there are very good reasons to suppose that racism isn't merely a gremlin in the system, but is rather indicative of something of significant import. It's worth pointing out that the white category is close to the aggregate category, so we aren't going to get much of a difference in these figures if we assume that the issues are white supremacy, which they aren't. The issues are, again, legacy problems, not problems of racism in the currents. At least, that is, not racism stemming from white Americans in the currents. I'd go a step further on that point and hold that we'd expect the differences between the average and white to be very large if the issues were actually explicit racism in the current, e.g. if the issues were white supremacy being actively expressed, we'd expect that the average would be well below the white category. This because if white supremacy was an actual problem in the currents, then it would be having some kind of effective form by definition of it being the problem, or it being the causal force that is in play. Though it also isn't the case that just because some category is well above the average that categorical supremacy is the problem. Hence, Asian supremacy isn't a real thing in the US. It is not the driving force behind the numbers. One can dispute that claim, but I think the disputes would be rather difficult. For instance, it is true that one could technically have a white supremacy problem, and yet not have it be the causal force for income disparities. Perhaps they just ain't that good at it, or that isn't their focus, or some other such thing. And one could have a white supremacy problem, and yet have it also be the case that it isn't manifested in the average incomes. But I mean, that seems unlikely tbh. Like, what would the point be of a white supremacy in a capitalistic society where privileges are measured via monies, whereby it is supposedly an effective force, and yet they just decide not to make it be the case in regards to monies? Sounds super strange to me. Likewise, if it were the case that there was a significant categorical majority, as in, say, 80% of the population were white, then we might expect that the average would indeed average towards the white population. But then, we aren't living in that reality either. I'd also kindly point out that all the racial categories are kinda fucked up ATM, as in, the races ain't purebred y'all. Folks who are white, or Asian, or black, etc., may not really be so, all depending on how one bothers to count race. But, that is a whole can of problems with the stats that I think muddles the relevant points needlessly and indeed counterproductively. Though I do admit that the issues therein are subtle, as in, we'd expect there to be serious differences between the racial categories predicated upon the legacy issues. Hence, a lot of the issues that would accrue from an active, white supremacy problem would also be in place via the legacy of such a problem. I think among the things to look at to differentiate this though are trends, and indeed the absolute values being alluded to here as compared to average values. Regardless, let's take seriously the points of the differences, and let's just not be racist shitheads, and hence not have an active racism problem to contend with. Cause fuck them, why not? The point here would be something like, pretending for the moment that there are some sort of active policies and efforts that can be made to address these differences, would do far and away better by addressing the racial differences rather than the gendered differences. In essence, the gendered differences are nominal in comparison to the racial differences. It could be tempting to say, hey, let's address both. However, I think that is actually a rather terrible strategy for anyone that is actually interested in meaningfully impacting the situation. For one thing, it directs the attention to areas that are not necessarily real. This point is really crucial to grasp at. If the gendered pay gap isn't a real thing to be concerned about, noting the pay for household labor issue is a real one, then any and all forces directed at it are not only going to fail, but may backfire spectacularly so. If the situation is fine as it is, in other words, doing something effective to try and fix it can only really make it worse. But even assuming that there is a real gendered pay gap, which there isn't, though again, pay folks for rearing babies, that is a real problem. Whatever possible effect we could have by addressing it will have only marginal returns on investment. It simply isn't going to be effective to the issues, even if it were successful. It is also very plausibly the case that all the low-hanging fruit on that issue has been dealt with, except for the paying of folks for the rearing of children, by the way. Hence, whatever kinds of solutions may be available may not be easy sorts of things to accomplish, save of course for the paying of people for the rearing of all the babies. Similarly, it is not the case that there are no issues with doing both at the same time. We can indeed walk and chew gum at the same time, but the reality is that by focusing on one issue we can and do often detract from other issues. There is only so much attention to go around, and only so much, cares that can be mustered for a given cause. Though paying people for the rearing of their babies is something everyone actually cares about, and it is actually something that would be effective across the board. I mean, the conservative estimate is a 10% adjustment after all. That ain't no small thing, y'all, figure it the fuck out. Finally, on this small point, the differences between men and women are small in any case, entailing that the benefits for addressing them are likewise tiny. Save of course for the issue regarding paying people to rear your babies. That is, even if we were to successfully address them, there would be only a marginal change. The difference between being, let's say super broke ass and rich, and between being middle class and rich are worlds apart. Triage it folks, and stop being little bitches about it. One really ought listen to the dudes on this one. Unlike, when we've grown tired of the ladies' tears, there just isn't many fucks left to be given over it. Targeting efforts towards handling the racial disparities also entails a more bang for our buck return on investment. Much as the last point makes clear, handling the very poor, the larger and more impactful problem, has far greater value overall. The number of fucks I give about someone having or not having their second car predicated upon their second income they don't really need as they living in their minor mansion are tiny. The number of fucks I give about the folks who live in poor conditions, can't feed their families well, etc., are a lot. The good that comes from giving them so many fucks is far and away greater than the fucks we could give or the fucks we don't give to the folks for their second car in their minor mansion. Minorities are women too. If anyone bothered to actually care about women as a category, they'd also care about minority populations, and they'd look upon the minority women as being the women in the most need. When women are cordoned off as their own category, this point gets seriously lost. Efforts made to address women's problems really become efforts to address white women's problems. It may or may not even be particularly intentional. As in, because the racial disparities are far more impactful in the currents than the gender disparities, white women, and let's be real here, Asian women too, are far more capable of directing any aid or assistance offered to them, needed or not, helpful or not. Throwing money and services at folks that don't really need or benefit from them is not only not going to help, it may make it worse.
Fuck you, you made this shit.